best bumpers in all of talk radio, the Young Rascals, and People Gotta Be Free. And, we're seeing this happening all over the Middle East right now. As you see, the thirst for democracy is showing itself all over an area where tyrants have been leading those countries now for years. I don't think we have many George Washingtons over there, but today is Washington's birthday, and we have on the phone with us today Richard Lim, who put together a wonderful website about the history of George Washington. Today, by the way, is Washington's birthday. I know President's Day was yesterday, but our first president's birthday today. And firstinpeace.com is the website. Richard Lim is our guest. And Richard, of course, Washington, as we said earlier, lost more battles than he won. Of course, Valley Forge was a tactical, it was a move of genius. And of course, it turned the tide of the war, and of course, Washington was victorious. And then after the war...
Trenton? You mean the Battle of Trenton?
I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah. I was going to say, Valley Forge was not that fun.
Yeah, right. But the Battle of Trenton, of course, it turned the tide of the war. We eventually win. And then after George Washington has won the war for the United States, he wanted to retire, right?
Oh, yeah, very much so. I mean, you look at his letters throughout his life, a lot of his personal letters talk about Mount Vernon, and he used a verse from the Bible to describe that he wished he could be back under his vine and fig tree. And so, you can imagine he had spent 8 years in war, and scholar Glenn Phelps writes that he never took a day off, no weekends, none of that sort, because the whole war was riding on his shoulders, and the destiny of a whole country and their descendants. So for him, it was an irrepressible burden. But at the same time, he knew that there was a home out there for him that he loved very much. There's an interesting story too about Mount Vernon, where when a British ship had docked on the Potomac right off of Mount Vernon, and his overseer had basically tried to appease the person, the British ship, and he wrote that to Washington because he was probably afraid that they were going to attack Mount Vernon and destroy it. And Washington said he would have rather had the guy burn Mount Vernon down than to have basically to have kowtowed to the British. So I think he definitely yearned for being back home, but at the same time, never at the expense of what he was fighting for.
Well, after the war was over, of course, he was the premier military figure of his time, as you write on your website. He was selected 3 more times to positions of civilian leadership, and I think a lot of people don't understand. Although he did serve only 2 terms as president of the United States, he was also the president of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and then twice as president of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, basically, when you look from 1775 to 1797, from the start of Washington's service as commander to the end of his presidency. Of course, there's a hiatus there after the war, prior to the convention. But essentially, he was a public man, and he was the foremost public individual. And even as he retired from the military as commander, there was a sense that the country might need his services again, or there was always a hope. In fact, after his presidency, when war with France was looming as a possibility, and he was well past, his prime. I mean, he left office when he was 65. They were still calling him to be back and lead the army again against the French. So you had a constant call on Washington's services, which it's incredible that he could bear it.
Oh yeah, and of course, as you write on your website, he had no historical precedents to guide him, but he played that premier role of establishing American institutions and traditions with his virtue and his keen judgment. and he guided that young nation, this thing that we now know as the United States of America, with our 50 states. At the time, it was really vulnerable, and while respecting the constraints that were imposed on him by the Constitution, he was able to form or to pull people together around him, and that America and its institutions have persisted to today, largely due to the wisdom and fortitude of George Washington. And it is just amazing the kind of man he was.
Basically, for a quarter of a century, the American experiment rested on his shoulders more than anyone else. And you look at other presidents, and this isn't to take away from them. I mean, obviously we've had great leaders come and go, but none of them were at the apex for that long. None of them had a career that spanned that scale. Even a president like Franklin Roosevelt, the fact that he was there for so long, Washington was there, if not as president, some way as the premier figure of the age for a quarter century. Lincoln was there for barely just past one term. And I'm not taking anything away from those presidents, but that just shows you the fact that really everything was on his shoulders for a very long time, and that it makes scholarship on Washington a daunting challenge. It makes it, and I applaud a lot of the scholars. There are a ton of scholars that I would never know anything, like Ed Lengel and Mary Thompson and Ron Chernow, Richard Norton Smith and Bruce Chadwick, and all these people. It's a massive, it's a huge task to try to write a biography on him, because really, or even like in my experience, I'm just making a website compared to these giant books, and it's a huge task to cover all that. His 2 terms as president, his all those years of war and everything.
Well, and of course, as we said earlier when we almost started this conversation, his finest hour was, of course, when he decided to step down as president after 8 years. And on your website, you do mention the fact that he lacked the literary imagination of Jefferson and Lincoln, but his greatest public documents did give guidance to the young republic, and his wisdom was celebrated for centuries by his countrymen, and still is. And of course, his farewell address was an incredible speech as well. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, the farewell address, I think, in many ways is very much kind of a microcosm of Washington's career in general. I mean, you have a speech that for many decades, after it was written into the 20th century, was really considered among the greatest documents in American history, up there with the Gettysburg, up there with the Declaration of Independence. Since then, it has kind of waned, and I think a lot of it is because of the way Washington is. I mean, we often know that Washington is significant, but we don't really know him very well. The people that do know about the farewell address can say, oh, I know what it's about, but they don't. I mean, they can summarize it maybe in a few sentences, but they don't really know what it's about. And when you read it, it's a speech that's full of practical advice. And obviously you have to understand the context, but, obviously Washington was not the wordsmith. He just didn't have the education of a guy like Jefferson. But he had so much practical wisdom, and he understood power more than anyone else did. He knew how to exercise it. He knew when to employ it, when not to employ it. And this farewell address reflects his wisdom. And I would argue that, you look at all these other great speeches, and yes, words do matter. Words are important. But, sometimes, if a document doesn't have that soaring eloquence, it really masks its significance. And I would say that this document, more than so many other documents, have actually had a real impact on how Americans, what policies they exercise in the next century or two. I mean, he spoke basically about American interests and the importance of maintaining American interests as the foundation of American foreign policy. And that advice is with us today, and it informed our debates all the way into World War II. A lot of people kind of twist the words. It's interesting. Woodrow Wilson has a very interesting interpretation of George Washington, and his views on foreign policy. But I think it allowed Washington to exercise his influence. I write this in the site. It allowed him to exercise his influence past beyond his own death, because
Richard,
I think he cared a great deal.
Rich, I have a quick question for you, and because we're speaking about Washington's farewell address. In his farewell address, Washington said you can't have national morality apart from religious principle. And
Right.
I know we have 2 minutes here before the break. Can you briefly explain, is that a conflict between separation of church and state? I agree with what Washington says, but how does that conflict with separation of church and state?
Well, again, separation of church and state, I mean, it depends on the meaning that you want to put into it. Some people view it as expunging any form of religious, acknowledgement at all in the public sector, and clearly that's not what the founders wanted. They had written into the, in the public letters, in public ceremonies, acknowledgments to the hand of God. Separation of church and state comes from a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote. It was definitely not on par with a lot of those documents. And I think Washington was saying, the thing that's interesting is that a lot of what Washington was saying was just a given back then. I mean, of course you had a diversity. You had deists, you had people that were kind of Christian, kind of deist, and you had devout Christians. And, obviously, you had Baptists, you had Unitarians, you had different sects, but there was never any question really of whether, morality should be a part of this country or whether religious influence, I mean, they were inseparable at the time. And now as society moves away from that, the issue takes on meanings that the founders never put into it, And so I think Washington, what he's saying there, and he's acknowledging the importance of reason, of rationality, that it was just, around the Enlightenment age, but he was tempering it with the sense that, well, without this, you can have all, the Enlightenment ideals all you want, but if you don't have the fabric of society, if you don't have morality grounded upon religion, the society will fall apart. And so I think, although now that's in question, then it was less so in question.
Well, Richard, I just want to thank you for being with us this afternoon. I've really enjoyed this educational opportunity to actually go back and take a look at the life of George Washington, and I encourage everybody to go to this website, firstinpeace.com. I wish we had more time, but we're running out of it very quickly here. But Richard, thanks again for being on the program. I hope you'll join us again sometime, and happy George Washington's birthday to you.
Thank you. I want to say hi to my friends and my parents and everything. Check out my dad's site. It's listed on the website, mansofatapple.com.
Thanks,
right.
Richard. We appreciate it, buddy.
All righty. Thank you. We'll be right back.
Talk Radio 1380. WNRR AM North Augusta.